Guys, welcome and thank you for hanging in there for a few minutes. So I just want to open up the floor again for questions. I don't know how many besides critique students are in here today, but our course has technically ended, but we have this week's critiques and then we have critiques next week as well to wrap up the course. So anyone can ask questions regarding the class or anything that you guys might have questions about for that final lesson from last week on detailing and finishing your still life painting. So if you do have a question, just go ahead and type it into the chat box now that it's working again. And if there aren't any questions, then we'll go ahead and jump into our critiques. Thank you, Penny. I just got your email saying that you can hear me and see my messages, but not the other way around. I'm glad we got that figured out. YouTube just changed their format for the YouTube live kind of platform. I don't know. It's kind of like a new YouTube studio system. So I'm glad we got that figured out. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and just jump into the critiques then. I don't see any particular questions. So we're going to start with you, Penny. And I pulled up your email here on the side, and so you just said that you have your original reference photo, so I imported that in color. And then you have two images you sent me, your first glaze color pass and your second glaze, where you only painted over the flower, the orange, and the glass bird and their reflections. But you want to talk about how to increase that saturation. So to me, the first critique, for the first layer, I think you might have thinned your glaze maybe a little too much. So with glazing, you don't always have to use a medium to thin the glaze. I don't know if you noticed this in my video, but sometimes I wouldn't use much medium or medium at all. It really depends on the pigment that I'm using, because some pigments are really, really oily and very, very transparent. And so if you add more medium to that, you're increasing the transparency and decreasing the saturation. Now, it's perfectly normal for your first glaze layer to look dead. You could even refer to it as like a dead color layer, because you're just starting to shift it towards color. Some pigments too have a higher tinting strength or a higher concentration of pigment, and so when you apply them as glazes, they will kind of saturate much more quickly than others. A good example is phthalo blue. Is a very highly chromatic and also has a very high tinting strength. It's a very powerful color, and so you can actually use that for glazing, and it's so powerful that it really tints very quickly. And that's almost something I would suggest for the bird, is to use a phthalo blue of some kind. Since it is a blue-green, it would work really well. And you probably wouldn't need to use much in the way of medium, because it's kind of an oily color, depending on the brand, but it tends to be a little bit on the oilier side. And in that case, you're literally just spreading it out really thin. And it might help to spread it out using a firm brush, almost like the opals that we paint with, the firmer white synthetic hair, and then soften it out with a soft brush, because it'll help it kind of spread out more quickly. And now it looks like you were able to get it more saturated in the second glaze, and that's something to keep in mind too, is that with this technique, we go back in with scumbles for a reason, and scumbles are that semi-opaque color layer. And that's because we probably want to resaturate or even brighten because every time you add a glaze layer, you're darkening your painting, and that can give that feeling of dullness as well. And so one technique I like to use is to apply my color glaze to resaturate the darks and the midtones, and then I will go in with white mixed with a little bit of that color, and I will scumble back in. And you probably noticed that I did that in that second color layer. So you just said that you did use medium on everything, so try without medium in some areas, especially when you get to those areas where you really want that rich saturation, like that pink flower. You probably would want to go in with your straight, I don't know if you're using like an anthraquinone or quinacridone red. You might even need to add a very small amount of like a warmer red because it's not that cool of a pink. So for example, you might even make two different glazing colors for that flower. You might make a deeper pink that's a little bit on the warmer side, and then a cooler pink for the lights. So, and that's for spot glazing. So moving forward, even from this layer here, let me grab a pen. So even for after this layer, I would mix two colors, one for your shadow, and so for that one you can see it picks up a very kind of a rich red that's very close to like a cadmium red, but we can't use cadmium very easily because it's very opaque. So I mean, you can use it if you find that your underpainting is maybe on the darker side and you need to brighten up. But that would be a scumble, not a glaze. So what I would suggest doing is maybe taking a little bit of trans red oxide, so like an iron oxide red. It's very transparent, and it's going to give you that richer, warm red, unless you have another kind of red that is a little bit brighter and more transparent. I think naphthol red, there's a couple of alternatives to cadmium that are a little bit more transparent, but still have that kind of warmer red-orange quality. But if you don't have anything else, you can use transparent red oxide with your alizarin substitute, whatever one that is, and that should give you a warm red for those shadows. And then for your lights, you want to saturate those lights here. So for something like this area, I would just use the straight quinacridone rose or whichever alizarin substitute that you're using. Yeah, it's more of a coral, and it depends on, certain pigments are only going to behave a certain way, and that's part of, learning to use a limited palette, and you kind of combine certain colors. So one thing you might be able to do is actually combine the quinacridone rose with a little cad red, and that's going to give you more of that coral color that you want, because coral is a red orange. It's just slightly cooler in some areas, especially you can feel the kind of opacity here. I'm just going to do some little color samples. So that's kind of an example of your red in the lights, and then here by comparison is your red for an average red for the shadows, and it gets a little cooler where it goes darker. So I'll just give you those two examples. So that's what I meant by you could go back into your shadows and scumble with a little bit of cad red. So how I would proceed is I would maybe do a overall glaze, one more glaze of your quinacridone rose over the whole painting. And in the shadow part, maybe add a little bit of transparent red oxide for those shadowy areas. And then while those shadows are still wet and while that glaze is still wet, paint wet into that glaze with a little bit of a cadmium. And you might mix a little bit of your quinacridone rose into that cadmium and cool it off a little bit. But you could go back in and hit these areas where it's a little bit richer. You might even add a very small amount of white, and that will help cool off that cad red a little bit as well, and make it more of a coral pink rather than a hot red. And then for your lights, you've glazed over it with your quinacridone rose or whichever anthraquinone red that you've used. And then you will paint again very similarly with that color plus a little bit of white. Now if that is too cool compared to this color, then you might add a touch of cadmium, and then you go back in and you brighten up these areas here selectively. But the idea is maybe use a little less medium, get that saturation in there, because opacity is really easy to add back in. I hope that makes sense. I would suggest the same thing for areas like the orange. So for like these shadows here, I would go in with an Indian yellow, less medium, and maybe add a touch of, so I'll do a little notes for that as well. Okay, so for your oranges here, they do need to go more saturated and a little bit darker. So let's take an orange sample there, and then we'll take an example of the other one here. So what you'll want to do for these shadows and versus the lights, because right now, other than value, they kind of look similar. So this one has a little bit more red in it. So you can use your Indian yellow, if you have that, and add a little bit of your alizarin substitute. And that's going to give you a little bit more of a rich saturated orange for that area, and don't use any medium, just spread it out very thin. When you're doing that, if you don't want to add medium to the painting, or sorry, to the mixtures, still oil out before you add your glaze. It'll help it kind of blend in and adhere. Just oil out very lightly, wipe off any excess, and then apply your glaze without any medium. And then for this one, you will want to add something very similar to this color, but you're going to add white to the mixture, just a very small amount. And that will help to brighten it up a little bit and also add a little bit more of that chroma that you're looking for. You could also, if you have it, you could use a cad yellow instead of the Indian yellow. It'll give you a little bit more saturation, but again, that is an opaque color or semi-opaque, and so that's going to be more of like a scumble. Does that make sense so far? So for areas, for the bird, I would suggest a phthalo. You could even probably use a cerulean for those lighter areas. Cerulean tends to be a little bit more opaque though. Now I didn't put these colors on the palette, but sometimes most artists have multiples, colors outside of the palette that I recommended. So, and there are cases where I find that I have to branch out beyond my limited palette, especially in still life, because you tend to get those really saturated colors. I think the yellow here probably could use a little bit more red, so I would go over this area with a glaze of just straight trans red oxide. And then if you need to brighten up areas again, maybe even trans red oxide with a little Indian yellow. Just make sure it's more of a kind of a reddish orange. Oh, okay, you have manganese blue. Manganese blue would actually work really well. I can't remember off the top of my head if it's a transparent or opaque color, but just take a look on the back. It should tell you on the back of the tube. I would say for the bird, it's definitely more of a blue-green, so stick with a manganese blue, the cerulean or a phthalo, something on the blue-green spectrum. And then for like something like your pot here, you're going to want to use like an ultramarine with a little bit, because it's kind of a purple, I would add a little bit of your alizarin. And then just saturate that a little bit more and glaze over. You'll notice that this kind of takes on a pinkish quality, so you'll want to glaze over those areas as well. And you might even find yourself having to go in here with similar colors from this, kind of a semi-opaque scumble to brighten up that area. And any colors in the metal that you use here, use it in here as well. Because you already darkened the values, so it should read as a reflection if you saturate it a little bit more. Okay, so have you glazed the wood here? I would maybe go over that with a trans red oxide and just saturate it a little bit more. And then you can paint back into that with a yellow ochre. So I'll make a note there. So you want to go for more of that color. So you're going to want a trans red oxide, and then maybe when you paint back in opaquely, ochre, just straight as your scumble. Well, so the wood needing more character, that's actually, you can do that in the color layer. So if you applied a glaze of the transparent red oxide over the wood, you could paint back into it with the ochre and maybe even a touch of white to increase the wood grain. You can also go in with a little bit of a darker brown to create some of that finer grain, but that actually can be built up over multiple layers with color. So I think if you want to just jump into color on that, that's fine. Okay, as far as your fabric, this color actually works pretty well in the painting. For the color of the fabric, you might warm up, do like a spot glaze of like a warm, very diluted yellow, maybe Indian yellow, but very, very diluted for just these lighter areas of the silk patterning. And then for any areas that start to move towards shadow, you're going to want these shadows to be blue because this is a very warm light. You can kind of see if we sample that color. I'll just do it over here. So we have that, and then if you compare the shadows, like the shadow on the edge of the table or even this shadow here, you can see that it's kind of a blue-gray. And so I think you could use a little bit of ultramarine blue, maybe even a little bit of your manganese blue, and glaze those shadows a little bit more saturated. So I'm just going to mark that here. I'll just say cloth. So these are the shadows, and that's the light. I hope these notes make sense when I send you the image. Okay, I think this looks fantastic though. It's really, really coming forward, and you can see how just moving from your glaze layer here to this one, doing a second layer has made a huge difference in building up that chroma. So glazes can be built in multiple layers and to really get that saturation as well. And so it's almost like we're adding that rich color filter, but that drawing is there. So even when you're painting back in semi-opaque, you're going to find that, and you're like scumbling, you're going to find that that drawing is there as your guide, even if you feel like you're covering up some of your painting. Your values are still there. Do you have any questions, Penny? Yeah, I realize that. And if everybody kind of feels like they need one more extra week of critiques, I'm happy to work with you guys on that, even if it's through email, or we can hold one more live session if everyone kind of feels like they need it. Because I realize there's a lot of disruption right now. And these glaze layers take time to dry. So sometimes just like 1 week might not be enough. So I'm here also through the forum, you know, if you want to work on this for several more weeks. We still have a critique next week on the schedule. And so we'll just kind of reassess where everyone is next week and kind of move forward from there. Okay, Kathy, so maybe we'll just hold, I don't know if Colin would like another week, but let's go ahead and talk about that next week and see, just get as far as you can. You don't want to rush it. You've brought the painting this far. And, you know, even in my demonstration, I did one more detail layer, but sometimes when I'm working on my own work, it might be, you know, 3 or 4 more layers. It really depends on what I'm painting and how refined and kind of detailed I want to get for the piece in particular. And that varies kind of largely depending on the painting that I'm doing. Even with portraits, sometimes I get it to where I want within 1 or 2 layers, and sometimes I want to take it further, or I you know, maybe did a looser underpainting and it requires more refinement on top. So there's always that variation. So do you have any last minute questions before we move on? All right, beautiful work. I'm really looking forward to seeing it next week. All right, Kathy, let's go ahead and start on yours. If you have any questions, I do have your email here. You said you didn't glaze the inside of the peel. You weren't sure what to use, and you also didn't glaze the shadow in the cup because you also weren't sure what to use for that. So we'll talk about that a little bit here. So I am feeling like the background is going to need some scumbling to not only to brighten it up, but to get that kind of creamy feeling that is on the background. Now you did start to cool it off and you are in the right direction. So I'm thinking that this is a color that you might want to mix opaquely. And so we'll talk about what colors you could use for that. So let me grab a different brush here. So that background goes from that to about that. You can see it's a kind of a taupe kind of color. And this is something to be noted. You know, this technique is great for certain things. Sometimes the straight glaze isn't going to get you where you want to go. So sometimes that's why we go in with the scumbling, because you need that opacity either to brighten it up or to get that type of color that you need, for example, that creamy color on the background. So I think you're headed in the right direction. So let's just take a quick comparison here. So that is where it is in the lights, and here it is in the shadows. And it's actually, you can see that shift. Here, let me actually reverse those. Here's your shadow, and here's your light. So you can see by comparison, you're actually really close to that. So I think just brightening it up again, you're going to feel like it feels less dingy and like dark. And I couldn't tell if this photo was kind of dark or grainy, or if that's the glaze, that kind of irregularity here. And that's okay. So what I would suggest is oiling this out and then making a cream color like this. And let's talk about what you could use for that. So you're obviously going to have, let me thin out that brush. You're going to have white. So I would still stick with your lead white if you're using that, or a transparent white. And then maybe adding a touch of blue because we want to cool it off. And then you can use any kind of warm brown. So you're basically making a warm gray for the lights. So you might use like ultramarine blue, and then maybe a tiny touch of like a burnt sienna, or a like a transparent red oxide. And it's going to be a very small amount of that because we don't want to warm it up too much. And you should be able to get something very close to this kind of taupe color. And then your shadow is going to be a similar mixture, but it's going to have a little bit more blue and the trans red oxide, so less white. But I would say it's still kind of blue dominant. That should give you kind of a nice neutral gray. If it's not quite right, you can try introducing a little bit of yellow ochre, a very small amount, and that might help get that creamy consistency as well. And then what I would suggest, I'll put a question mark next to that yellow ochre. What I would suggest is oiling out your background and start with the light area and slowly move towards that dark, because you might find you like something like this pretty close, but you might want to brighten up this area. So let me do a little paint over with a glaze. Let's just see how that would look. So when you're scumbling, it does help to oil out a little bit, but make sure you wipe off the excess oil, and then you're not going to make your scumbles thinned out with any medium, because that medium is already kind of laid down. So if we go in, and you would basically be applying this scumble over the light areas, and you should see some of that underpainting and those glazed colors come through a little bit. It's also, scumbling naturally has kind of a, especially when you're using white in your scumble, has a natural cooling effect. It's an optical cooling that happens, it's not necessarily like you're laying down a cold color. So it's one of those ways that you can create that cool vibrancy, is to have a darker underpainting and then brighten it up with a little bit of white, and it's going to cool that optical effect. You like the shadow shape on the wall? Oh, are you asking, Kathy? Yeah, that's always an option you can add in later as well. So I would maybe concentrate on lightening up around this area and then start to fade it out, maybe around here, and switch to the other color. And like I said, you're not that far off. You're just going to be brightening up a little bit. And you saw how I went over my background, and even though my background is quite a bit darker, I did go in with that opaque color and brighten it up, and same thing with the tablecloth. So look at how I applied those in that lesson, and you can use the same process for your background. So that's going to kind of help that area. So I'm going to erase over the leaves here. Your leaves are pretty good in terms of how dark they are, but I think they need a little more yellow. So you might consider glazing over that with an Indian yellow and letting that dry, and just see where that takes this green here. Maybe even take a little Indian yellow with a tiny bit of blue, glaze over it again, and then paint back into that with maybe a little bit of that same mixture with a little white. So that's going to give you that brighter green. And that will help intensify the feeling of that chroma in the leaves. You can see even just adding that slight opaque scumble, because you already have kind of a bluish cast to those greens. So I think just making them a little bit more yellow is going to help. Okay, so the flower, you're in a pretty close color family. I think it's going to be a similar thing to the background. In those light areas, you're going to want to make a buttery yellow. So let's just take a look here for that. That's the lightest area on the flower, and let's take a look just like at an average shadow. So you can see that the shadows have kind of a yellowish green cast to them. And then let's just take a quick sample. Yours are a little bit lighter, and let's take a look at your... Okay, so you can see that there's a slight shift in the hue. So let's talk about that first. So here is the flower. And here is yours. So you can see that this has more of a yellow green to it. So you might find yourself needing to go in with maybe Indian yellow. Plus a little bit of blue. It's going to feel a little strange to put green or cool color in those shadows, but go ahead and do that first. And then yes, I agree. Well, you can see that this color is a little bit too of a green yellow, and this is more of a pleasant kind of buttery yellow. And so probably what's happening is this is getting too you have almost a reverse of what's happening in the picture. Here we have a cooler shadow and a warmer light, and here we have a cooler light and a warmer shadow. So it's kind of creating that opposite lighting effect. So you want to go with more of a butter yellow in that light. You can use white with a touch of yellow ochre if your yellow that you're using is too green. What yellow did you end up using? One of the reasons I suggest, apart from the transparency, an Indian yellow is it tends to be a yellow-orange. And cadmium yellows can be more yellow-green, especially when they're kind of thinned out. So I was just curious what yellow you ended up using for your glazes. Lemon yellow. Okay, that would explain. So lemon yellow is more of a yellow-green. I mean, I don't know what brand you used, but it has a tendency to go kind of greenish, and which can have that kind of a garish feeling if you're using it for something as delicate as this. So if you have yellow ochre, you can use that. So yellow ochre, or even if you have a Naples yellow, that would work too. Because it has, so yellow ochre and white, or Naples yellow. And then I would just scumble over those light areas. Start with that first, and then see about the shadow color. So for the shadow color, you use that Indian yellow and blue, or you could even use that yellow ochre with blue and see. That yellow ochre already has a little bit of opacity to it though, so it might kind of cover up some of those shadows. So just make sure you're finding something close to the value that you need. Okay, so you might try your Naples yellow in that light. You won't need to add, you probably won't need to add any white to it depending on the brand. Naples yellow is one of those colors that can either be really light or really dark. So use that as a scumble in these light areas and start there and then see how you feel about those shadows. I do still think they probably will want a little bit of a greenish quality, but you could try even just going with like a blue-green as a glaze. So maybe a, I wouldn't say a phthalo blue because it seems too strong. but just kind of a blue-green. Because if you think about your still life, you have a warm light and cool shadow feeling here, just in general. Now that doesn't apply everywhere, just because you have this like area where the light is reflecting into the bowl, for example, from the table. But I would say like this light here is very warm, and could be what's happening is your cup has a greenish cast and maybe that's reflecting into the shadows on that flower. So you can be a little more direct with the colors that you're mixing. And I know this was just your first glaze layer, so it has kind of that broad color scheme, but as you get more specific, you can glaze spot glaze these areas and scumble to modify the hue a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to move on. You had another question about this shadow. So if we let's just take a little color sample of that shadow. So that's kind of the shadowy color. And I think this looks sunk in, so I can't quite tell. But that's kind of the color it's showing. I think it's probably a little warmer than that just because this is burnt umber, and I know that that has a little bit more of a warmth to it. But if you compare the two, you're pretty close. I would say this just has a little bit more of a greenish cast to it. So you might take, and this is more in like the violet, red, brown family. So to shift it over, you could probably just glaze it with a little bit of a soft green. Again, maybe something like a little bit of ochre and ultramarine blue, mostly ultramarine blue and just a touch of yellow ochre, and apply that over this shadow here. It's also going to help bring a little bit of illumination to that shadow. I can't tell if it's gotten dark just because of the drying of the umber. One area you can also resaturate here is that reflection down in here. So for that one, you might take a little bit of, here, let me draw some lines here so we don't get lost. So this is your shadow, and this is that shadow there. Okay, so for the bottom of the plate, so I'm just going to do it over here. So you have more of like just like the usual umber color, and you want to make that more of a red orange. So I would just say a glaze of that transparent oxide red straight out of the tube should give you a little bit more of that effect. And I do think your table needs to brighten up. So moving forward, I would actually re-glaze your table with the transparent red oxide. So I'll just say this for that and the table. And then paint back into it with yellow ochre. It's going to mix with that glaze while that glaze is still wet. And you're going to be able to get some of this wood grain and brighten up some areas of the table that need brightening. And that's going to help you move a little bit more towards that richness and texture of the table and getting that more finished. For the interior of the peel, so you kind of have this warmish, it's just the grisaille underpaint, and it actually works, but you can see that some oranges, especially clementines, tend to have more of a yellow to the interior of the peel. So even though we tend to think of the inside of the peel or the pith as white, it's a whitish yellow. So that's an area where you could use that Naples yellow. But I would start off maybe glazing it with a warm yellow. So if all you have is your lemon yellow, try mixing your lemon yellow with a red orange. So like a transparent red oxide. That should kind of counterbalance some of that green. If that's the only transparent yellow you have, you might try applying a single glaze of that color and then painting back into it with your Naples or a little bit of white mixed with that color. So for that one, that's where your grisaille is, and that's where we're headed. So I'm just going to draw that here. So I would say yellow, any yellow that you have. If it's too green, add a little trans red oxide, and then you can use your Naples yellow to scumble back the lights a little bit brighter. I think your cup ended up really close to that color. I think just where the shadows are, maybe spot glaze those shadows a little bit with a little bit more of a chromatic green. You might even have to make a semi-opaque one that matches this color. For this area here. Because it has that minty kind of quality in these halftones. And that's going to help those lights actually read a little better as well. And you can start to add your spot glazing of the yellow flowers and some of that patterning as well. For your oranges, you could start to introduce some of that pith, the white kind of detailing. And you might find yourself wanting to, like this area got a little bit dark. So like the transparent red oxide maybe. And you can see this has a little vibrancy to it. So if I just take that sample there for those creases, and that's because this is a transparent kind of membrane, so that light is really illuminating those shadows. You can see yours is a little bit on the darker side, and it's a little more dull. So what I would say is introduce a little cadmium red into that with cadmium red and one of your yellows with maybe a touch of your alizarin. And that should help to intensify these areas. And you would just be spot glazing that into these little creases or any other areas that feel like they need a little bit more of a rich chroma. So you might be brightening up some of these shadows just a little bit so you can see that they're a little on the cooler pink side and a little bit more dull. And so we're going to beef up the chroma by using those higher chroma colors. I think actually this orange here feels pretty good in the light area. You're pretty close. You might find yourself needing to do a little bit more of a scumble, but I would get the darks a little bit closer to where they needed to be and then decide if you want to go in and scumble those oranges, the lighter areas of the orange. I would say the same for this part of the orange here. You might find yourself, if you have a cadmium orange, it's almost like the perfect color for the orange. You can also make it by mixing cad red and a little bit of like a cad yellow. Maybe a little red oxide into that mixture, but you can use that as a semi-opaque where you want to saturate these midtones. And you won't end up having to repaint the whole orange, most likely. You'll find, like if you oil it out first, you can kind of just spot scumble these areas that you want to intensify and blend them out into the glaze, or into the the couch layer, the medium. Yeah, you can grab your cad orange. It would be more of a scumble, so you're moving into scumble, so you can start to use some of those opaque colors. It's a great one. Cad orange has a little bit of transparency, I think, more than if you'd mix cad red and cad yellow together. That might vary depending on brand, but you can try using that where you want to build that intensity into your oranges a little bit. I would say the same for this orange here. This one needs to brighten up a little bit, and just by comparison, you can see that using a little cad orange is going to give you that chance. And maybe even before you indicate some of the white veining on that, you might want to brighten up those areas. So one of the lessons in doing this technique for underpaintings this is something you just, with experimenting with the technique and also just experience painting, you might start to notice, like, I need to make my underpaintings brighter than they appear to my eyes, and it's kind of hard to do. I often find I still need to go in and scumble in the end, but if you think about it, you are applying the glazes, which are darkening what's already there. So if you make your underpainting 1 or 2 value steps lighter, then by the time you add your glazes, it should fall closer into the range. And this is especially true for those light areas. And very rarely do I ever just go straight in with a glaze and never have to scumble back in. I mean, I pretty much almost always do, just because that's what it takes to get some of the effects that you need. Whereas, those transparent glazes do have their place as well, especially for where you need those really punchy, saturated areas. And you don't have to thin your medium or your colors as much with medium sometimes. So it really kind of depends on the subject that you're painting as well. So if I was painting like a red rose, for example, I might start off with my grisaille and then do my kind of deeper red glazes, and then I would go back in with a cad red and hit those lighter areas, even though it's opaque and it's going to cover my underpainting. Does that make sense? It is a big learning curve. And I don't always use this full closed grisaille underpainting technique. But it's an excellent way to learn how to do still life, and just in general to learn how to paint, because you're breaking down the process into, obviously we had the drawing stage, and then we had our kind of tonal sketch, and then we move into rendering values and forms. And that's one of the key elements, because a lot of people forget about values. As soon as we start to introduce color, it's very easy to lose sight of your value structure when we're starting to introduce color. And so that drawing and that finished underpainting is kind of a guide and parameter for the values of your painting. And you might be tweaking things, but it's not as big of a change as if you were just going in with straight color, like in an alla prima, for example. Yeah, this looks great. I think just going in to those areas and take your time. And if you find you need maybe another 2 weeks, then we can talk next week about doing another critique session. Do you have any questions? And with experience, practicing this technique. This is how I used to do all of my paintings. I would do an entire closed grisaille. Now I just kind of leave it at the tonal sketch in my personal work. Typically, I leave it at the tonal sketch stage, and then I will go in with color. And it depends, but there is something to be said for doing the closed grisaille, and it sometimes depends. If I feel like my subject could benefit from this technique, then I'll use this technique. Sometimes I'll leave it maybe a little less refined in the underpainting and then do the rest of the refining in color. So there's a lot of ways to kind of tweak this process to your own style or your own timeline. Some people find it a little redundant to do more of a finished underpainting and then repeat the steps in color. But I would just encourage you to continue practicing this technique, even if it's on a simpler subject, like a single piece of fruit or something like that, just so that you can really get the hang of it. In that book I sent out to everyone, you can see how I did it like a persimmon, using the same exact process. And in that one I do go in and scumble, so you can see where I'm going in with those opaques and brightening up some of the lighter areas. Oh, good. I'm glad it arrived. Yeah, for some people it might take a little longer to get to you, depending on where you are in the world. But I'm glad. It sounds like most people have received theirs by now. All right, so if you don't have any questions, we're going to go ahead and move on to Colin. Beautiful work though, Kathy. I really look forward to seeing your painting next week. All right, Colin, are you ready? So you had mentioned in your email, let me just pull that up here. So this is your third pass. And you said you've oiled out the background several times. It still sinks in a little bit. And actually, let me talk about that really quick because I don't know if some of you are part of the group with me on Facebook. There's a couple of different groups that I'm a member of. One is traditional oil painting and painting best practices, and I try and limit to a few. But there's been some talk about the use of burnt umber in painting, and I know there's some artists who say they completely advocate against using umber. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. One of the reasons I use it is because it is a very fast drying color. So for the purposes of an underpainting, you're using that with lead white, and your underpainting dries very quickly, and it's very well cured for those upper layers of glaze and color. However, it does have a tendency, because it's kind of a mineral clay-based pigment, it has a tendency to darken a little bit because of that sinking in. It has a tendency to pull the oil into those lower layers. And so you do get that kind of patchy, irregular drying that can happen. And burnt sienna, also a natural pigment, has a tendency to do that as well. So there are certain pigments that are more synthetic and they don't tend to sink in as much. So if that bothers you, the sinking in, you can use a couple of alternative pigments that won't have that same problem. However, they will take longer to dry. So you could use a transparent oxide red or iron oxide, which doesn't tend to sink in as bad as like a burnt sienna or umber. And you can use it with a little ultramarine blue. So it has a tendency to take longer to dry because of that ultramarine blue. Another option out there is you could use a raw umber, so burnt umber is heated up and burnt essentially. And so it has that redder kind of quality. But it does also increase the likelihood of it kind of sinking in and causing some of those issues. So you could also use a raw umber. It still has some of that, but maybe not nearly as much. Another solution kind of around that is to use a medium that increases the gloss to your paint. So with umber, you could use a little bit of Galkyd regular. Now I used Galkyd gel in this painting, and it's actually a new medium to me, but I like gel mediums in general, and I really liked how this one behaved. Personally, I'll probably start to incorporate it a little bit into my process, but I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit because you go out there and there's just so much information on materials, and generally I recommend using the most archival practices and archival materials as possible. And some people have issues with umber, but I continue to use it just because it is that quick drying pigment, and actually it doesn't. So that when they used to, if you read like old texts on, I'll try to refer to this, and I'll see if I can find the article I had read about umber and post it in our forum. But they used to mix it with their lead ground to apply to their canvas. So instead of like how we apply like a imprimatura, they would go in and apply mix it into the ground, and it really then pulls the oil out of your paint. It sinks in, but it doesn't have a tendency to strike through lead white quite the same way as it does like another type of white. So there's some, I guess, controversy over that as well. certain things tend to strike through other color layers. But I haven't had any issues, and I've been using this technique for 10 plus years, and I haven't had too much problem with that. And there is ways to work around those sinking in issues. Personally, I just have to produce work quickly because it takes me so long and so many layers to finish my work. I find that the umber dries quickly enough that I can go in the next day, and sometimes, and even in the summer, especially in the summer, and just keep working on my painting. So I just wanted to preface that a little bit. So Colin, if you are struggling with the sinking in and it's really bothersome to you, you could try in your next paintings to try and use a different pigment combination for that underpainting. You might even get like an empty paint tube and just mix a large batch of it. If you decide you like it better. Like I said, the transparent oxide red and a little bit of ultramarine blue should give you a very similar brown. It's going to be a little bit more transparent for that underpainting, but you might find you like it better. Okay, so you had also mentioned you're pretty happy with the lighter reds in the background. They're a little more clear to you in real life in the painting, and they don't come through in the photo as well. But yeah, it looks great. I think the fabric in the background looks really nice. I actually like that you have it a little bit darker than it is in the photo reference because I feel like it helps the scales jump forward. So keep that in mind. And you said the Madonna looks a little rough, so you're going to work on softening that in the final pass. Yeah, so try to just look at how she has some softer edges. That's my main suggestion. So for example, where this edge is, you're going to notice that it's a little bit softer the way it rounds here. I realize that picture is a little pixelated now, but so it rounds off a little bit. So a lot of it has to do with edges. Your question, you're going to try an alternative. Does it make a difference if you're working on board? So what makes a bigger difference is not so much whether you're working on wood or working on, or like a different type of substrate or canvas, but what matters is the ground or the primer that's used on those canvases. So anything that is oil primed, lead primed is going to be less absorbent, therefore sink in less than using a gesso or acrylic based primer. So a traditional gesso primer, so you can buy that too, is like gypsum with rabbit skin glue. And that's like painting on fresco chalk. It just sucks the oil right out of your brush. I can't stand it. I've done a few paintings on that and it's just way too absorbent for my liking. Acrylic gesso will be a little more absorbent than any kind of oil-based primer. So one of the ones that's the least absorbent I've found is like a lead ground. You could either use the one by Natural Pigments, or and I think you can't access lead pigments where you are. Although Natural Pigments does have a UK site. I don't know if I've ever sent you the link, but I can post that to where you can order from them in the UK. But if you get like Winsor Newton and Gamblin make an oil ground or oil primer, and it's an alkyd titanium white based, and it's very easy to apply. I just use like a cabinet high density foam roller brush for like painting your cabinets, the really, really fine textured one, and I lay that down my primer in a few layers, and it gives you the most beautiful kind of enamel-like surface to work on. And it does not absorb the way a traditional gesso might. So should you put more detail in the fabric? I would say no. I like the way it is right now. I think if you put too much, again, it's that how much detail do we want to put in every area, and it's tempting to put every detail in every area, but you really want to, the idea is to direct the viewer's eye through the painting. And if you put more detail and brighter lights in that background, it's going to pull the eye. The higher contrast and the more variety that you add to an area, the more you're telling your viewer, this is important. And so I would say the scales are more important. You know, the Madonna, the little bottles in the foreground are more important. So you can play down everything else a little bit. Let's see, you're not sure if you'll go darker, but focus on the light red. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's richer, and it could have to do with the pigments that you're using. Like I said, I do like what you have. If you wanted to, you could go in a little bit lighter, but if anything, my suggestion would maybe be taking like this shadow and making it a little bit more chromatic and rich, and that might mean a little bit of a scumble. So if we take that color for the lighter part of the shadow, and then we take the lighter part of your shadow, you can see yours is more brown. And so by making those shadows a little bit more chromatic and richer, it's going to help the whole painting feel richer. So you might want to take, my suggestion would be a little bit of Cad Red. If you have Cad Red Deep, it might help because it starts off at a darker value and it tends to be a little cooler. And then you can add a little bit of your alizarin substitute. And then you would just very thinly scumble that shadow a little bit. And it's going to richen up that shadow enough. The key is not to get it as light as this though. So make it a little bit on the darker side. You could go in with a little bit of that straight Cad Red light for a few areas, but like I said, I would just play it down a little bit more than it is in the painting, I mean in the photo reference. Because I like what's happening with the scales. Let's see. I think the color in here looks better in the bottle. Those look really good. Let's see. It looks like you have the box pretty much finished. I think you could probably go a little bit more of a kind of a buttery yellow right in here and brighten that up a touch. So if we take that area for the box, that's just the lightest part. Yours is a little bit darker and it's more on the brown side. So you could go in with a little bit of a scumble just for that lightest area. Maybe a little bit of Indian yellow, or yeah, maybe stick with Indian yellow just because it's a little bit richer, and a touch of white. So Indian yellow plus white, maybe a little bit of red oxide, but I would just try the Indian yellow and white and then do a very thin scumble, just mostly, here, let me take this sample. I would kind of start off on this edge and then just fade it as you go to the left. And you could actually even use some of that same color kind of down in here, because I see a little bit of a richer orange down in there, just to add a little more variety. I would say also warm up those shadows a little bit on the Madonna. You did up here, I can see where you added a little bit more warmth. Maybe concentrate a little bit of that down in here in the robes. So if we just look at that shadow color for like the darker part of the robes, and then we compare that just to the, and now we're comparing like the hue. You can see yours is just a cooler version of that same value. So you just want to go a little bit warmer with that one. I would watch out. Now let's take a look at some edges. The hard edges here. Now whenever we're painting something that is really structured like a book or something that naturally has a hard edge, it's really tricky to handle that, like the edge of a wood board or anything that's really straight lines. So just look for how you can soften those edges a little bit. For example, between here and here, maybe not having a darker line there. You have a nice softness to the edge here, so kind of doing that along the edge here all the way can help. You do have a nice lost edge through this middle part, but maybe find an area where you can have a little bit of that lost edge, so that way that cast shadow or contact shadow here and this line here isn't so jarring. And because it is so close to the edge of the canvas, you might want to bring a little less attention to it. So maybe soften those edges, especially on this corner. Let me catch up with your question here. What would be the impact of silk varnish? Oh, on the silk. Varnishing when it's time, would it beef up the tonal range? However your painting looks while it's wet. So if like when you freshly oil it out, that's how your painting will look when it's varnished. So what I always suggest is when you think you're done with your painting, let it dry really well, and then oil out the entire painting. I think I mentioned this in the final video at the end. You want to oil out the entire painting and take a look at it. And if there's any areas that you feel need adjusting, they need brighter, more impact, more, either that's higher contrast or, richer color, then do that, and then do the same process, oil it out again, and make sure you're happy with it. That being said, you don't want to oil out the whole surface too many times because without painting back into it, because it can create kind of a tacky quality to the surface of the painting, which can be a magnet for dust. So I tend to do this when I'm just pretty sure I'm done with the painting. And this is before I varnish, so that way it evens out the surface a little bit, but it also helps me see how the painting will look when it is varnished. And if there is any last minute touch-ups I want to do, I can do those. So that being said, there's a couple of different ones you could do. You could use the Galkyd, regular Galkyd, which has a glossy feeling. And you can, I think I mentioned this a little bit with the formula. I usually mix a little bit of the cold wax with the Galkyd and a little Gamsol. And that gives me a slightly less glossy finish. And I apply it over the whole painting, and that helps kind of create an isolation varnish. And when you want to wipe off any excess medium, you can use a dry, kind of fluffy brush and kind of stipple the surface, very much this way we evened out our glazes. Or you can take like a sponge brush and do the same thing and wipe off the excess. And that will help bring it to a point where you could photograph it if you're wanting to photograph it and you're happy with it, or you can make any final adjustments before you varnish. So if you're unsure if an area is going to look richer, just oil it out and see how it looks. And that's going to tell you what it'll look like when it's varnished. Do you have any other questions? So I would say just mostly work on refining the edges on the Madonna and that foremost corner of that canvas panel that's in the painting. Maybe adjust a little bit of the light area on the box. I think the scales look finished. You might look at some of the hard edges in here, and since it's a feather, look for where you can soften a few of them. Just a little bit of softening will go a long way. And sometimes how I soften is just to tile a slightly darker value along the edge and blend it in, and that will help create the illusion that it's turning. Okay, so let me catch up on some questions here. So Janet, you asked how long do I wait before oiling out or to put on the final varnish? Oh, after oiling out to put on the final varnish. Sometimes it depends on if I need to send the painting off. Generally, you want to wait as long as possible before applying a varnish. Traditional Damar varnishes I don't use anymore because they have a tendency to crack and they're hard to remove, and especially with a classical technique, they tend to chemically bond to the glaze layers because it has like a resin in it. If someone ever were to remove the varnish, then what happens is it removes your glaze layers, which would be a nightmare, as you can imagine. So I use a synthetic varnish only. But with traditional Damar, they say to wait 6 months to a year before varnishing, which is a really long time. And most of us don't have that kind of time before we have to send off a painting to a collector, or, if we're trying to submit it for a show. So with the synthetic varnishes, they say you can technically apply it as soon as it's touch dry. But I generally wait until as long as I can before I varnish, because I just think it's better for the painting to let it dry without any layer on top. So a couple of weeks at the minimum, 4 weeks maybe. You want to make sure it's really not tacky at all on anywhere on the surface, and it doesn't even feel damp or moist to the touch. It should feel kind of bone dry. The paint should feel hard if you press your nail into it. And so just kind of wait for it to feel really, really, really dry, and then you can apply your varnish. So I use Gamvar, and that one technically says that it will let your lower paint layers cure and continue to dry. And because it's a flexible varnish, it doesn't bind to your paint layers. It's one of the more archival ones to use. There's also a really good one called Regalrez by Natural Pigments. It's also a synthetic non-binding varnish that can be easily removed with just a little bit of gentle Gamsol. So you can look into that one too. But that one's like a 2-part mixture you put together. And I just use the Gamvar mixture. Okay, Colin, you had a general question to do with oil paintings on board drying quicker than canvas. Not to my knowledge. Drying time has a lot more to do with the moisture and temperature around the painting that the painting sits in. I think I talked a little bit about this last week. You can speed dry your painting by setting in a warm environment. I would say the ground can have a little bit to do with it. Canvas is breathable on the back, but if it's well primed as it should be, there should be nothing that can reach the front of the paint, of your oil paint, through the back of the canvas. So it really shouldn't affect it that much. That being said, if you're painting on something like aluminum, which is more subject to fluctuation with the temperature, like if you're painting on aluminum like I do, sometimes I notice that when it's cold out, the aluminum is very cold to the touch, and therefore the paint dries a little bit slower. So that could have more something to do with the speed of drying. The other thing that influences the drying speed is the pigments you're using. Some pigments just dry quicker and others don't. All right, so this looks great though. I think other than just looking at those edges, and one thing, whenever I'm bringing my painting to a finish and I'm asking myself about those edges and detailing and like how much is necessary, just try to step back from your painting as much as possible. And another thing is, if you have a black mirror, you could just take a piece of glass and spray paint the backside with black, or paint it with acrylic black, and then look in the opposite side of the glass, the reflective side, and look at your painting in the reflection. You will start to see if some areas are jumping out more than they should. Like that can be edges, that can be, it's kind of similar to squinting, but you'll see if some certain values are jumping out, or maybe some edges are still feeling distracted or distracting in the painting, then you can look at that, and it's a great little tool as well. Do you have any other questions, Colin? Or anyone else, actually. If Colin doesn't have any questions, you guys can type in your questions to the, oh, you use a black mirror. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's really useful, not only for reversing your painting and looking for drawing corrections, but use it for helping you see your edges a little bit. And, you know, it's kind of like stepping back from your painting as well. It helps to, you know, look at the big picture. So does anyone else have any other questions before we wrap up our critique? All right, thank you, Colin. This looks really good. I think if you start to bring it in to focus a little bit with those few areas that you had already mentioned, you'll be finished very, very soon. Thank you, Ludmilla. Thanks for joining in. All right, if anyone has any other questions, go ahead and type it in. If not, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. All right, guys, I don't think anyone else has any questions. So I will see you next week, same time, and we will talk next week about the possibility of one more critique session, depending on where you guys get in your painting. And of course, you can reach out to me on the community forum or by email anytime during the week if you have questions about what to do with your painting, if you're feeling a little stuck. All right, guys, thank you so much, and have a lovely Saturday. Take care.